This talk I wanted to have about what the self is, because I was watching this video from Omnia about the evolution of consciousness from, a single-celled organism, an amoeba, or an E. coli cell, I think is the one they used as an example, upward in complexity toward humans, us. So it starts off talking about the way that E. coli has like the simplest mechanistic version of what consciousness in general could be considered, because it has like it has something to do with the way that the proteins interact with the environment directly. Like there's a sugar molecule in the environment, and that chemically alters the mechanism, protein chain, or whatever it is that's inside the E. coli, and it will swim straight because of this chemical interaction. It doesn't think about it, but it has this chemical interaction with its environment so that it can react to it. If the sugar molecule is absent or there's less of it, then it will swim in a more random motion, or it's not swimming straight, it's swimming off in some random direction, randomly switching directions. And it doesn't think about it. It's just that it mechanistically has that happen to its body. So what the movie is getting at is that there's a level of consciousness that's so fundamental or simple that you don't think of it in terms of having a self. And I thought that that was very interesting because I'm an animist, and I believe that everything that we can perceive of is composed of nothing but selves. So there's a panpsychism kind of idea, but that's the idea that that consciousness itself is fundamental and that everything is made out of consciousness or is some kind of a holographic image. And I used to believe that for a long time, but I've since extended it. I now think that everything is made not only of consciousness, but something deeper than consciousness is souls. I think that everything is made out of subjects, that there are the fundamental monad, if you will, of all existence is the individual, the self, the soul. So when the movie was talking about how there was no self in these E. coli bacteria, but that the self emerges when the organism can become self-aware, where it can become aware of its own internal state and then make choices about its environment to alter its internal state, something like that. And that's pretty close, I think, to an idea that I believe in. It's that, and I don't know much about integrated information theory, but it seems legit to me just from what I've looked at, perusally, but I haven't really delved into it or anything. But it seems to be accurate, and it goes along with my vague beliefs about my system also. So the self, from what I think it to be, is a micro. It contains a microcosm of, I guess you would say, its image or representation of the relationship that it has with the world. So it has a physical relationship with the world chemically, electrically, etc. And then it has a relative or theoretical relation with the world because it will create digital cognitive maps about spatial distributions of the world around it, even though that's not the actual world. It's an image of the world. It's the cognitive map of the world. And that's why it can be wrong, and you'll see a mouse go down the wrong lane when it's trying to find the cheese or something like that. If it has remembered the path and you haven't changed it and it still goes down the wrong path, it's because the cognitive map in its head is either wrong or not being used well. So there's a cognitive map there, but that's not physical, it's not objective, it's a theoretical map. And this is what is kind of, I guess maybe the word is spooky came to mind. I don't know what the word would be to describe this relation between the mind and the body. But the body is an actualization, which is a convergence or affirmation between possibilities. So if multiple possibilities converge, then they actualize. But if they diverge, then they don't actualize. If they diverge, it's because one of the possibilities is mutually exclusive and won't tolerate or allow the other possibilities to exist. And this goes into modality, the field of modality. And the field of modality is about, I think, in my opinion, it's the highest realm of the relative field that a human could comprehend. I also believe that it's infinite, so this is only one step above classical logic. The classical logic is universal in the sense that it believes in one world and doesn't believe there's anything outside of it, etc. And there's a lot of these assumptions that get baked into most people's conventional way of looking at the world. And I call that submodal, and that's its own thing. It's like the submodal view assumes one of the three modes. And that's how I know there's a field of modality, because there's three of those submodalities. If there was only one of them, if the universal system truly was universal, if there was only one system that existed and that was it, and it just was that, as in like just how the mouse has the cognitive script about the maze, God would have a cognitive script about us. And so if that really did exist to the point that we could grasp it, then there wouldn't be room for any modalities, or submodalities, I should say. There wouldn't be any room for any submodalities. Submodalities exclude the other two modes or modalities. The modalities themselves don't necessarily exclude each other, but a submodality will. It will still obviously include that mode, its respective mode, but it'll exclude necessarily all the other modes because it's inside of that mode. So there is a submodal logical way of looking at the world, which is to say that it's an exclusive universe. And this is where there's only one truth and everything that isn't it must be false. That's a submodal view. That's where you get if-then implications, because if-then doesn't matter, that implication doesn't matter where or when you are or who you are or the way that you're doing something. It doesn't care. It just is irrespective of all that. And there are things that are like that. Like, if you were to think about like numbers, right? Because if you have a multiplicity of numerical values for the same representative image, then it'll be like 2 equals 3 or some weird shit. At which point all math breaks down. It doesn't make any sense anymore. So each of those numbers would then be its own exclusive submodality. It's not a mode, it's not a full mode, but it's inside of the mode, it's a part of it. So it's submodal. So it necessarily requires an exclusion of the other numbers that are around it so that it has its own exclusive value. And yet there's the fractions that are in between the numbers, which would be like the causal dynamism that's between the absolutes, or the causal dynamism that's between the parts of those absolutes. And the absolutes are the modes. And there's three of those, and it's nothing, indiscernibility, and being. And it's the same. And this is like, you have to understand the three modes in order to understand anything about my theory, because again, like I said, it is modal and uses modal logic. So what's true in one mode isn't going to be true in another. What's true in one world won't be true in another. And that's why there will be worlds in which there are possibilities, but yet they don't ever actualize because they're excluded from their counterparts. They are not able to converge and become real because they're either intolerant of other possibilities, or other possibilities don't tolerate it. But if there's an intoleration or an exclusivity necessarily, where if they were to try to converge, there'd be some contradiction, and they would not be able to fit just because of their quintessential differences. If that happens, then they don't actualize. They're prevented from actualizing. Like, I can't ever jump 10 feet in the air while still being me, while still having my own composition of weight and my bone density and the rest of the stuff that makes my body incapable of jumping 10 feet in the air. But if those alterations were made, then I could jump 10 feet in the air. But then the contradiction happens between me and becoming having a body that can jump 10 feet in the air. Switching bodies or altering my current body is beyond my financial ability to afford and my mental ability to comprehend. So thus it's impossible presently, but in the future I might be able to learn enough about it that I could actually do it. But given the exclusivities, I can't jump 10 feet in the air. And if I did, I wouldn't be me, or we wouldn't be here. So it's the self then, to go back to how the modes tie into the self. So there's a subjective mode, which is the theory sees it as nothing, or you could make it religious, in which case it would be God. But but either one will work. Because of the limits of relativity, because God is just as far away from the field of relativity or any theory, so too is nothing. So you could interchange them in the theory, and it won't change anything about the theory. But the contextual value that you render from the conclusions that you would draw from the theory would be vastly different. Because contextually speaking, if there is a God, then everything is imbued with that divine purpose, and we learn about God as we learn about the world, and there's something that's going to happen to us after our bodies are gone. There's all kinds of personal implications for each person. Do you owe God that relationship? Aren't you missing out? Something like that. And there's all different ways of looking at that contextual value. But if there isn't a God, then then it's more like existentialism, where there's not really a real meaning in anything. The meaning is always digital, it's always holographic, it's always projected onto reality rather than it being extracted from reality. And I think that if you view it that way, that you'll end up being really incapable of understanding the fullest depth of profundity. And I've seen movies like The Ledge where I've seen profundity expressed necessarily because of atheism. Like when the guy says that since you're going to die and there's not going to be anything after that, it makes every moment matter more. And I know exactly what he means. I felt that myself. Where it's like, what makes everything matter is that it can't ever be replicated, and that it will end, and that there's only one of it. Its rarity is valuable. But if you look at it from a religious perspective, then people tend to believe in things that are not actualized in the physical world. So then to include things that are not actualized in the real world as being real, or considered part of reality, or some aspect of existence, they're given some credence, some weight, some value, then you would say that the meaning of everything gets projected from God onto it, because without God there wouldn't be it to exist, kind of a thing. Or that it wouldn't bother existing. Like it could, it had the ability, because materialistically we could interchange that with nothing, and it could have just spontaneously come out of nothing, sure, but what would keep it around? Why would it bother persisting? It would be suicidally depressed and horrified to find itself in an endless vacuum or void with nothing except itself. What would keep it alive? What would keep it going? So there's some subjective reasons to the justification behind believing in God, but there's not a logical one, because you could just as easily flip that on its head and say, well, isn't it burdensome to live your life under the shadow of someone else more superior than yourself? How do you even express your own individuality given that level of influence, imbalance, where God's influence is so necessarily greater than your own that you're suffocated by it and you can't really exist without it? That really then makes you less than a single person. You're no longer even one person. You're stripped of your own personhood. You then are basically just a shadow. And isn't that sad and meaningless and burdensome? So you can say whatever you want either way and find a logical justification for each one. But like I just showed, it's vastly different. The conclusions, the contextual values that you'll draw from it are completely different. And yet the arguments are, equal, but opposite. Same evidence, but yet two different conclusions, kind of a thing. But anyway, so each self has a microcosm of the relations that it has with the world. So it will have a cognitive map about where everything is distributed spatially. It will have a memory about what has happened to that cognitive map in the past and in the future. And that there's a reason I bring that up. It's because it doesn't have direct access to the world. It only has direct access to the cognitive map about the world. So again, if that cognitive map is wrong, its error can cascade throughout the person's image. And this is how crazy people are born. It starts off with one thing that they got wrong, and then because they refuse to correct that error, they sacrifice everything else for it. And sometimes the belief is, God hates fags, or something like that. It might be something that's subjective. It might be a point that the person just has subjectively and refuses to capitulate, refuses to negotiate. And so they make everything revolve around that, and because it is intolerant of anything except itself, the person has a lot of difficulties with their environment, but they don't ever have to say that it's because of that. They can always say it's because of something else. And the reason that they can say that is because there's the independence in between the cognitive map of the world and the world itself. If there weren't, then we wouldn't be able to err. And so then our cognitive map and the real world would be identical. They'd be the same thing, actually. And then we would never make these errors, but we also would never have our own view. We would never have any view, because there wouldn't be room for a view, because there would just be it. And that's the necessary distinction and exclusion between information about something and the thing itself. So the thing itself can't become the information about it, because then it would cease to exist. And the information about it can't become it, because then it would cease to be information, and it wouldn't be able to be derived or extracted or transmitted or communicated. So if the information became it, then it would be invisible as far as any information processor. It would be identical to nothing. And it would be identical to God. So those are like the two views, and I'm a Trinity kind of person. I like everything in threes. I don't believe that you can reduce anything down to less than three and still have it exist, because I like my three modes, and I'm in a weird way old school like that, or I will be considered old school in the future for only having the three modes all the time, every time, because there's complexities that are beyond it. If there's a field of modality above universal submodality, then ostensibly there's probably another field beyond modality. So we all sin, we all err, but we all get closer to God as we learn and adapt from those. Not from having made them, but having learned from them. And that's different, and it's also difficult. And I don't know if I'll ever really succeed in it, but anyway. The thing that makes a self is that it has that microcosmic reflection or cognitive map of itself existing as in some world. So its cognitive map of the world isn't just centerless. It isn't just some floating in free space kind of thing. Its limits, its reference frame, its dimensions are determined by the experience and sensation and perception of the subject that's perceiving and sensing them. So they're very much connected to that particular self. If that self, for example, has no sense of infrared or ultraviolet light, then its cognitive script will necessarily not include those. It's not that they'll be included with some random value of noise. It's that they just aren't included at all. They're not considered real. They're not considered part of reality because the organism doesn't sense it. And so, when we think about how God judges things versus how we judge things and how we're always in error, then we have to require a forgiving God that would forgive us of our sins, or else we're necessarily going to eternally burn in hell in existence as evil, and therefore God, from our viewpoint, must be evil. And so that can't be the case. Or if it is, I don't want to know that. I'd rather not know that if that's true. And I choose to believe that God, having created creation and sustains creation, values creation and has some reason for having created it and a reason for not destroying it, even though he could. And I think the reason is because of that independence and integration and sustainable interactivity, the other two modes. But I'll start with just independence because it takes a long time to try to grasp these deep concepts. And I hope that these are accurately being portrayed and not just a mishmash of gibberish. But it is a little bit difficult to understand, so it's not something that I would expect a person grinding through this to understand the first time. This is only ever going to get read by someone or listened to by someone if I end up becoming famous or people end up recognizing the value of my work and then go back and look at this. And it's a low chance. That's why I don't really try to present myself very well most of the time, and I don't give much attempt to try to make everything as pristine as it could be, which in turn feeds into the probability of me not ever obtaining the success that I don't believe that I'll have. Because if I don't believe that I'll have it, I won't work for it. If I don't work for it, I won't succeed, and there it is. So there is independence in our views of the world. It isn't a chemical reaction where it just automatically gives us an accurate view. It's something that is colored subjectively. And like I said, the difference between the context of there being a God and there not being a God, for example, will change the values that you will then use to guide you in your perceptions about what is and what isn't real, what is and what isn't good, what is and what isn't the focus, what is and what isn't relevant. So all of those things, what may or may not be included or excluded out of that cognitive map about the world. And thus, are you going to be able to see the error before it actually happens? Are you going to be able to adapt before it happens so that you can succeed despite it? Or is it going to swallow you whole because you won't admit that it exists or something like that? So there's a level of independence between the subject that's perceiving the world and the perception of that world. And if there weren't, then we'd all have the same interchangeable cognitive maps about the world. And to the degree that we have the same cognitive maps about the world, then yes, we could say those parts of our cognitive maps are interchangeable, and therefore they reflect the independence of the environment to us. So if we agree about what is in this world, and we say there is a fridge, there is a stove, there is a wall, we must be in the kitchen. If we say those things and we agree on them, then those things must be independent of us. But if we disagree about what, like maybe someone would say the fridge stinks, I smell something in there, and the other person's like, well, I don't smell anything. Maybe it's your upper lip. And so they might have a completely different view of that, and so then smell would then be viewed as being dependent upon the self, because one of them didn't sense it and the other one did, and so it depends on who it is. So the more subtle ones, especially, like if it's a really quiet, subtle noise and one person hears it and the other person doesn't hear it, it might be because the sound is actually there and the dependence is in the sensory equipment that the person has. If the person is younger, they might be able to hear it better. If the person is older, they might not be able to hear it. And so their cognitive map wouldn't include that noise because it was too quiet for them to hear. Versus the younger person includes the noise because they were young enough to be able to hear it. And so there's a dependence not just in the subjective, contextualization or the choice of the subject to view existence as inherently good, inherently evil, or inherently neutral, or amoral, like it doesn't have any innate morality to it. You can view it that way too. So that's the contextual, fundamental value of all the things. And then if it's applied then to the relations, then it's going to be, well, then, given that everything is good, everything is evil, or everything is neutral, depending on which one of those I choose, what then is my relation with the world? Is the world antagonistic toward me, at which point it's not really relevant to focus on or value anything that would, quote unquote, be considered good to someone else, because you're not going to trust that anyway. It's just going to end anyway. So you're going to prioritize, and we always have to prioritize, the negative over the positive. You're going to look at the things that are openly antagonistic towards you, or things that could become antagonistically threatening to your existence, that you could perceive as being possible. And then you have to pay attention to all of those. Instead of paying attention to the good things that could happen to you, you disregard those as being rabbit holes that lead to nothing, that are distractions, because they don't support your view that everything is out to get you, that everything's evil. And this isn't a judgment against someone that has that view. It's just that's the way it is. And then they'll take that as a judgment against them, and that's just the way that paradigm is. And it, and if somebody gets stuck in there, then that's where they are stuck. And the only way that they can get out of that is, again, they have to realize that there's more to it than that. There's not just that. There's also the equally absurd assertion, which I'm sure they could agree is absurd, that existence is inherently good and that everything is always trying to do good for you, but that you just disregard it. It's just as absurd as thinking that everything that it's doing is evil. And then you can appreciate it by going to the neutral state. You can say, well, maybe everything is simply neutral and I just make it good or I make it evil depending on how I look at it. So the antidote to one is the furthest away from it, which then leads them to the middle ground between the two. And that's how you get someone out of the hole. They don't jump out of it, they crawl. There's one step in between. So if you present a pessimist with an optimistic view in such a way that the pessimist gives it credence and starts to consider it and think about it, they will not consider it from the same perspective as the optimist and just assert that everything is good. Oh, isn't life great? They're not going to just jump into the sky like that, or jump into flying, as Nietzsche put it. They can't. They're not going to jump into flying. What they're going to do is they're going to consider it, but they won't completely take that view. They'll take a neutral view, and they'll assume, well, maybe everything is just the way you look at it. Instead of it being all evil, maybe it's just the way I'm looking at it that makes it seem that way. And if you can get them there, they can occupy that place without trying to jump into flying. But if you try to force the person to jump directly into optimism from pessimism, they will never do it. They'll just become more entrenched in their pessimism. So this happens when you do this stupid thing that I see humans do all the time that I've never understood, which is to yell at someone because they're sad. And I don't understand this view. But I keep seeing it over and over, and I do it. I've done it, at least in this talk, but I don't do it like to people in my presence. By the time they're in my presence and I consider their personhood, I would never think that that would make sense to yell at someone who is sad. Like, you're a dick, you're a piece of shit because you're sad and you think that everything sucks. People do that all the time. Humans will do this all the time. They'll insult people that are like pessimistic, that they're like down on their luck, or they feel like shit, and they'll actually actively aggressively get angry at them and use like either verbal insults, or they'll like weaponize things, or or they're like, I'm gonna slap you if you don't start having fun right now, and like just weird shit like that. It's not often, it's not like over and over, it's not the norm, but it does happen. And every time I see it, it's like, what is this? What are you doing? Why are you angry at someone for being sad? It doesn't make any sense. And it's because they're not taking the sad person's personhood into account. They just want to parasitically glean energy off of them, and because they're not giving it to them, they get angry. You're not giving me my free energy. You're supposed to be giving me good, happy feelings. You owe me, thing. Give this to me. Or die. So, it's just funny. It's like, you can still be an optimist, but be an asshole about it. You just like disregard everybody else's shit. It's like you're a Libra, you're all like charismatic and charming and happy and fun, but you're only that way because you're intolerant of anyone that doesn't give you that feeling. So if anybody doesn't just automatically make you feel good, you just kick them to the curb and kill them off and steal from them and lie to them and fuck their wife and just whatever, you know. But as long as they're making you feel good, okay, well, now we're happy, everything is good because I'm just going to parasitically glean energy off of this person that's making me feel good. And thus, consequently, having gleaned it, it will be of me, and then I will be charming just like them. But I'm not charming because I am charming. I'm charming because I'm feeding and reflecting off of your charm, kind of a thing. So that kind of a parasitic, psychopathic view is due not, again, because of pessimism, because the person's obviously optimistic, but they're a psychopath. And so, like I say, it's got many dimensions. The subject is complex, so you can have these views, and it's easy to dismiss because you could say, well, that's exclusive right there, so you just proved it wrong. It's not wrong, it's just complex. You can have an optimistic versus a pessimistic view, and you have to take the view of neutrality to jump between the two. And, for example, an optimist can then lose their optimism by having doubt that everything is good, and then starting to then claim, well, maybe it's only looking good to me because of the way I looked at it, and not because it actually is that way, but only because I looked at it that way. And that's how they lose their faith and become pessimistic. So it is true. Now, the reason why they might do that depends on, for example, one of the things that it might depend on is if the person's a psychopath. If the person is a psychopath, then they don't believe that any other person around them is inherently good. They believe that things are good for them, or they're not good for them. And so the psychopath, in being an optimist and claiming that everything is good, is everything is good around me because I won't allow it not to be. Its goodness is then dependent upon me allowing it to continue in my presence. So even though it's inherently good, it may have decided to be in someone else's presence, and I can't tolerate that, so I'm going to go and steal it, and it will then be in my presence instead of over there. Kind of a thing. And yet still be optimistic. I believe I can do that, and so then I go do that. It's kind of like solipsism. It's like the psychopath believes that there are no other people. So the reason that things are good, the reason that everything can be good, and yet you're still a psychopath, and this would be like a corporate psychopath, the reason that everything is still good, even though you don't believe that there's any people out there to be good, is that you only believe in what's good for you. And then you only tolerate what you feel like is good for you in your presence, and thus you become your own God, and you sustain your own world, and you have what you have, and other people have what they have. If they are even people, then they have what they have because that's what they chose to have, in the same way that I am who I am because of what I chose to have. And so there is a distinction only in their choices, kind of a thing. And in that way, then you can say, and it's good that that's the case, because it's good that things are judged by what their merit is, by what they choose to do, versus just having intrinsic value given to them, which they would find to be babying existence or people. So you could be a psychopath and claim that everything is good because it chose the right things at the right times. It made use of its resources that it had available to it. And there's also a certain level of randomness in that, where there are some things that happen that just happen because they happen, and not because of what the person did. They didn't necessarily deserve it. And that's good, because that gives everybody an equal opportunity for ups and downs and changes in mobility, where things aren't just stuck. So that if you are at the bottom, then you can have that random chance, like everyone else around you has, to rise up to the top. So it can still be considered good, but it wouldn't be considered good in the way that most people would use the term good. And that's what makes the thing kind of like not seem to fit or not seem to make sense. Their version of goodness is simply what's good for them. So that means that they would value evolution, because the things that are more integrated would rise to the top. Just because of evolution, they can combine and network with other things and thus amplify their own abilities, and they can mitigate against their own problems, and they can sustain themselves longer in the future by networking. They don't have to be perfect themselves. They can have their imperfections mitigated by other people's successes that are around them, that they can tap into. And so, like I said, it makes sense then for there to be corporate psychopaths that only are quote unquote your friend because they are trying to get something out of you or you're useful to them in some way. So there's a goodness to them that it's good that they get to use you, right? But you wouldn't personally consider that to be good because you have taken into account not only their personhood but your own. And so, because you take your own personhood into account, then you think that it's not good. But since they didn't do that, then they do think it's good. And this is what I was saying is like optimism alone isn't actually enough. You can still be a psychopathic optimist. Jim Jones was a psychopathic optimist. He was like, well, yeah, look, see, isn't it grand? Isn't it great? All of this energy and all of this stuff and blah, blah, blah. And don't you just feel so great in my presence? And they did. People did feel great in his presence. But then he decides that he wants to drink the Kool-Aid and make everybody else drink your Kool-Aid. And so then they all drank the Kool-Aid and now they're all dead. But it isn't because he was a pessimist. It was because he thought that was a good thing. Why? Well, because they'll all be with me in heaven. Or because they all deserve to die and they wouldn't have died unless they had done this. And since they committed suicide, all the better because, no one had to go out and murder them. They just took themselves out, and that's because of me. And so then I cleansed the earth of evil. And, and either that or I preserved the goodness that was in them. I've heard of like mothers drowning their children in the bathtub because they value their children so much they don't want them to experience any pain at all. And so then they're like, well, there's necessarily going to be some pain in life, but since I can't tolerate a world in which anything happens to my child, then I'll just kill them. And that way they can't be hurt because they'll be dead. Which I think is so absurd, but somebody in that mindset could view it that way. And that's what's good for them. Well, I know little Jimmy won't be suffering because he'll be dead. So then little Jimmy won't suffer, and then I've protected little Jimmy by drowning him in the bathtub. And so that's how that is. Now, if a person develops this microcosm where they become aware of their own relation with the world, they develop these stories. Other people are there to be used. Other people are there because they're intrinsically valuable, and God lets them be there, and they're there to show me something important, and I should listen to what they're saying. Things like that will make our focus shift, even though the evidence is the same. We all get presented with the same world, but we all think differently of it. And so the way that we're looking at the world isn't enough, because the world is there to be looked at. It's independent of us. But yet, the value of it, what we do with it, what our choices are about it, are going to change depending on our contextual value of it. And so, of what we see of it. And that's how you can determine whether or not there's a self. If you see diversity in the species, there's a self, because they're making different choices based off the same environments. And so that pattern of behavior is what you'll be able to objectively measure. Patterns of behavior. Do they steal? Do they lie? Do they cheat? Do they murder? Do they rape? Do they sacrifice themselves to help others? Do they put themselves or other people's lives first in emergency situations? Now, or do they do it all the time? Maybe they do it all or most of the time. And it's, and that is a choice. It's something the person chooses to do, and it gains momentum over time. And so then This is why I laughed as an animist, is because if I can change myself, then I don't really have a static self, do I? If I can change from moment to moment, then I am not really this static crystalline version. This solid object of what I call me doesn't really exist. My self-image is just that. It's imaginary. It doesn't exist. It's a holographic projection. And yet, if I didn't have that, I wouldn't have a self. So then what is the self? It's fractal. Because I have an image of myself, my self-image has an image of itself. And its self-image has an image of itself, and so on, all down the line. And so then it's measuring depth. And again, if you get deep enough, then you can reach these cores, these absolute values, where you can't go any further. And when you get there, then you become aware that there's more than one of them, and that there's in fact three, and that they have this horizontally, causally dynamic, decentralized, dynamic relation with each other. And then you can start being really, truly free. And what I call lucid is when you've rooted all the way down to the core absolute value, and you've looked at the world from that view to the depths of your being, and then tried to go to some other view. And I mean that, like, the degree of lucidity depends on the degree of depth. The degree of depth is going to depend on what your body is physically capable of sustaining, and your mind. So, like, my mind, I went to a place where I felt emotions so deeply that I physically almost died from having felt them. And I didn't know that those existed. I didn't even know that was possible. I thought that would be just ridiculous, but it happened to me multiple times. And so, yeah, I believe it. Now, if it doesn't happen to you and you hear someone else say it, that's one thing. But if it happens to you, then you believe it. And so that's where I am. But, you know, and I didn't even believe that that was possible until I went crazy. And when I went crazy, it was that I just didn't even know what was possible. And that was my level of craziness, and that's what has to happen. And you go crazy for a while, and you go, I don't know. It could be anything. It could be nothing. It could be something I don't even know what it is. And those are the three absolutes: nothing, everything, and indiscernibility. So, and I use everything and being at this loosey-goosey stage of the game interchangeably, but I shouldn't, because later they're going to be more distinct. But right now, since I'm not completed yet with the book, I'm still kind of speaking off the cuff, and things are just unfolding naturally and organically as we speak. I'm learning things. So, like, that's a new one, that you go into these root cores, and you feel like everything is worthless. And then you could have a self-image which agrees with you, and its self-image agrees with it, and its self-image agrees with it, all the way down until you say, I am not just willing to say this about myself, I'm willing to say this about other people, and then I'm willing to say this about existence itself, and then I'm willing to say this about God. And then when you get all, throughout all of that stuff, you can measure your level of, self-angst and saying that, I can or I can't accept existence the way that it is, and it is or isn't this way, etc. The depth to which someone goes in those is dependent on the number of self-images that it has developed, that it's aware of, and that guide it. Now, to be in that ultimate state, I remember being in that, and you don't have room for recognition there. You lose self-awareness because you've reached absolute bottom. So you're not aware of yourself in these states when you actually reach them. You only become aware of it after you come out of it, or before you're in it. So that's the danger, and that's why people go out and kill people before they ever stop to think, am I still going to feel like doing this tomorrow? Am I still going to wake up tomorrow and feel like that was the right decision to make? And if you ask them and they really seriously thought about it, then they would have to say no or I don't know. But because they don't ask that question, it never gets answered. They just kill before they ever ask that question. And so then that is what happens. But if you go through that process and you go all the way down there and then you survive it and you come out of it and you start looking at things differently, then you can say, I remember when I was in that state, and I remember when I used to feel like everything around me, including God, was at fault and that there just was nothing to be done of anything. And even if I succeeded, that would still be just as horrifyingly evil of me to do as just sitting here and rotting, that there was nothing that I could do that would not be evil except to not exist. And there would be nothing that other people could do that wouldn't be evil except to stop existing. If you're breathing, you're wrong, kind of a thing. Even if you're my own mother, even if you're my own child, even if you're God, if you're breathing, if you exist, you're wrong. That kind of a belief, like I say, destroys one's ability to be self-aware, because the awareness is so absolute, it doesn't leave room for any more self-reflection. So while, like I said, that's a part of lucidity, it definitely wouldn't exemplify it in the sense of it being like, if you were to attain that level of disregard for yourself and everyone around you, that you don't have any distinction about individuals, then you could end up being a mall-shooting murderer if you've kept your ego along with you this whole time. Or if you're doing it for religious purposes, then you may attain enlightenment. And this is what I was saying about the interchangeability logically between God and nothing, is that it's just something that's beyond your purview, something that's beyond your ability to discern. And it ceases to be logical. It's something that's beyond logic, and therefore it must be either nothing or God, or something like that, something that's beyond any ability to relate to directly, that we can only learn about in pieces and bits and, shadows in the dark kind of a thing, rather than it being a full-blown direct image. So when someone does attain those absolute states, it's not necessarily to say that that alone is lucidity. It's when you come back out of it and then you go back in from a different angle than you did the first time. If you are able to get multiple modes, then you will attain lucidity. And that's because in order to do that, you have to actually shift your mode of being to where, let's say, for example, you went to the view that everything is equally valueless, and you go into the depths of nihilism and you experience the absolute state of nothing, and you actually get, your awareness is like stuck in that. If you attain that to the degree that you can, and then you come out of that and you regain, the same, at least neutral assertions that it just depends on how you look at it. That's how I looked at it then, and that's where I was then. And then now I'm going to look at something differently. And then you'll go deep down into that. Instead of it being nihilism, it could then be existentialism, which is everything is fundamentally indiscernible. It's not that it's necessarily worthless, it's that we don't know what the worth of it is, because the value of whatever it is hidden, and we don't get to see anything intrinsically the way it actually is in and of itself. We always have to relate to it, and through our medium of relation, we're always going to color it and distort it so that the image isn't exactly the same thing as the thing that's being experienced. And given that level of fundamental relativity, then it does really just depend on how you look at things. And then that's the core of it, is that you experience the existentialist absurdity of existence. And if you survive that, then you get your own particular endemic, quintessential view about what you believe is valuable about existence, etc., in relation to the general, if not meaninglessness, at least not centralized meaning of everything. So you'll then view your own individual structure within a world which is indifferent to that structure, ultimately. So that's the absurdity and the horror, and also the passionate almost bravery of the one that does that despite that. So you can be inspired and be an existentialist. And you can also be inspired and be a nihilist. To say that everything has no value is an assertion that's very distinct from saying that we don't know what the value of things actually are. But to say that things have no value then frees someone into doing all kinds of things that they wouldn't normally have done. Like, if you think that you're going to die, you might, go skydiving or go, bet on a horse race or something like that. You'll start doing things that don't require you to have survived it or don't require you to have succeeded at it, because you only have a few more days to live or a few more weeks or years or whatever to live. Or you could be like Jigsaw about it, or you could be depressed about it and horrified about it, but the way that you look at it is free and open in existentialism. In nihilism, if everything has no value, well, then at least everything is valued equally, and so you can appreciate the equality between all things and find that to be perfect, and say, even though there are no such things as values, and those are just imaginary representations and images that I holographically project into my own holographic self, and that's why there isn't any value, is because everything really is nothing, and it's trying to be, it's in the process of becoming, but it never truly is. And that then gives you this impossible idealism of what if it could be, instead of simply just continually becoming. What if its potential were actualized? And this is like the impossible dreams of communistic utopia and Luciferian utopias, where you can do whatever you want to do and maximize your freedom of expression to the nth possible degree with little to no consequences or something like that. That level of inspiration can come from active nihilism. I'm going to further the evolutionary chain by picking off all the weak ones. So I'm going to be a mall shooter and kill off all the randos, leaving people like me alive. And it'll be one more act against the weak, the inferior, the disease-ridden. And it'll be an act of cleansing. But on a larger scale, it would have happened anyway, and someone else would have done it. But it happened to be me, and I did this kind of a thing. There's all kinds of ways of looking at these when you get into the depths of the absolute core that you're using in any particular moment, to the degree to which you're using it. You'll get these levels of depth, and the greatest levels of depth are in the purity when we only have one of those absolute values. The trade-off is that you become less aware because you become absorbed by it. And that's what Dostoevsky was talking about when he was, or was it Solzhenitsyn? I forget if it was Dostoevsky or Solzhenitsyn that wrote The Possessed, but that's what he was getting at, I think, is the possessed person, the person that gets possessed by an ideology. And I've never read the book, by the way, but just judging off of what other people have said about it, and when they've used this example, it seems to be used in this way, as to suggest that people become possessed by their ideologies, and the ideology makes their decisions for them instead of them making their own decisions. And that's what happened to the Nazis, and that's what happened in the Stalin era, and all of that kind of thing. And I heard about it from Dr. Peterson's lectures, and I thought it was really interesting, that kind of a concept, that an ideology would think for you. But yet, it seems to be the ideal, doesn't it? That I'm making a mishmash of random self-contradictory things. They aren't integrated, and if I were to make decisions based off of a truly integrated ideal system, then something other than me must be making my own decisions. If only I ever make my own decisions, I'll always make the decision that's easiest for me. Or I'll prioritize things based upon what I arbitrarily define as what my priorities are, and not what's truly needed for me to have as my priorities. At which point I could become an alcoholic or a drug addict or any number of things. Versus if I have an ideal that's making the decisions for me, while I might feel like inducing something, while I might feel like yielding to my addictions, then my ideal will make decisions for me that I wouldn't have been able to make for myself. So again, it always depends on how you look at it, and that's because logic is relative. It doesn't have a center, it doesn't have a single unified whole to it that you're able to draw a conclusion from that you know has to be true, because all of the theoretical cores from which everything else is originally derived are going to be singular, or they're going to be finite, and they're not going to include absolutely everything. Because if it were infinitely complex, then it would be the same thing as the thing that already exists, and it would be like a computer it's trying to compete with reality in simulating it to the same level of resolution that reality itself is at which point the computer becomes a reality, would have to subsume reality, would have to be reality in order to do that. Because the simulation in attempting to achieve the same level of complexity as the thing that it's simulating, if the thing that's being simulated is of the same complexity as the thing that's simulating it, then they become each other, because there's no difference in a simulation and a thing except in its level of complexity. If it's a good simulation, I should say. And if it's an erroneous or distorted or fictitious simulation, then it's not really being true to its definition of being a simulation. A simulation would be something that's as realistic as possible, given some parameters, and that's what its referent is. So that's what's being simulated. So when we develop these, coming back again to the same idea about the self is that which has a microcosm of itself in itself, which is a really horrible, butchered way of trying to describe it, is that it's infinitely reflective, and that's why it will eventually find one of those three absolutes. And then you go, oh, okay, that's where I'm rooted. But that's not really true. That's just where you're rooted at that moment. Because then you can just uproot and go to some other root, and then you're just as much there as you were in the other place. So they're not really quintessentially you. Otherwise, you would just be stuck and fated to the same viewpoints that you've always had, and you'd never be able to learn or change. And yet people do all the time, for better and worse. So it's, and to just change in some horizontal ways, to just be different, like just try some different genre or different style or something like that, and that's just nominally horizontally different. It's not like better or worse, it's just maybe more authentic or something, but not better and not worse. So people having the ability to change and demonstrating the ability to change means that we don't really have a static self. What we have is an infinitely reflective fractal self-reflection. It's a reflection of a reflection of a reflection of a reflection, until, like, if you were to take two mirrors and have them face each other, they have a self-feedback loop, reflection, reflection, reflection forever. That feedback loop, that what do they call that? A recursive algorithm. So super recursive algorithm is a self. So that means that the output of one algorithmic rule is the input of the next algorithmic rule. That's a self. Now, that's a self in the sense of its relativistic self. That's what makes its cognitive script, its cognitive map, its digital holographic self-image is a giant integrated system of hypothetical syllogisms, where it takes some central axiom that it just assumes to be true, and then derives from it and other definitions their derivatives of what conclusions of what should be true, given the truthfulness of the premises. So what that then is it's a mind. It's not the self in totality, because you also have a soul and a body, but it is your mind. So your mind, or self-awareness, consciousness, is a super recursive algorithm where the output of one is the input of the next. That's what that requires. The output of one is the input of the next. And so then it's said to recur or iterate, and you'll have the same process repeated over and over and over again, but yet the outputs and inputs will converge or diverge. And they'll either converge around one kind of asymptotic limit, or they'll converge around a true convergence point where they reach a static value. Usually it's going to be an absolute value like 0, 1, or infinity. Sometimes you'll get some that reach this terminal value where it no longer changes, where the output and the input don't oscillate around an asymptotic limit, but they are truly indiscernible from each other and are exactly identical and the same. And that's one type of convergence. And then divergence would be the opposite of that, which is where no matter how many times you run it, you just get different answers every time. They don't seem to converge on any particular area or range of values. It just goes all over the place. So if they diverge or converge, then you can draw conclusions about their divergence and convergence, even though the processes don't ever change. Irregardless of whether they're convergent or divergent, the processes don't change throughout the iterations. Only the inputs and outputs change, because they get fed back into the same rule over and over. The same equation, it gets rerun over and over and over. And so it's processing the same information longer and longer, deeper and deeper, as I like to say. And the depth of it will then be discovered to be of a certain amount. It takes a certain amount of iterations to converge or diverge. And so then you can measure its depth. And there's all kinds of different measures that you can use, but the deeper that it is of the number of iterations that it takes in order to reach convergence or divergence usually has something to do with the complexity of the process. There are simple processes that have longer iterations than others, but I think that's one measure that we could use to determine the type of consciousness that someone would have. For better or worse or neutral, but it's a type of consciousness. So a self, then, consciously would be a super recursive algorithm, where the output of one is the input of the next process. But it's the same process, but the outputs and inputs are directly connected, and that's what makes the self appear. And like I said, you can actually build entire worlds inside these. They're not necessarily just simple. So, with all that being the case, the self, I believe, has three parts: the soul, the mind, and the body. And the mind is just simply that super recursive algorithm. And it uses like I say, all theories, no matter what they are, all logical theories have an edge where they just cease to be logical. And that happens when either the deduction becomes an induction, where you actually have reached the limit between relativity and empiricism, objectivity, and you actually see the thing that it's describing theoretically, you actually see that happen in practice in real life. And so then it's no longer about logic, it just is that way empirically. Or it ceases to become logical because it's become subjective, at which point it's we're talking about the axioms that we use to define everything else in the theory. And those original axioms from which all the other things in the theory come from are themselves obviously not deducible, because you have to start somewhere. You have to start with something. You can't just pull logic out of your ass. You have to pull it out of central axioms that you believe to be true but can't prove logically, that necessarily exist outside the logical system that you're using, because they're the things that are defining that logical system. So they would be like the reference frame or the window frame itself, not the thing that's outside the window that you're looking at. So those would then be the soul. The body is obviously the manifestation or actualization into empiricism, empirical reality. The subjective thing that generates the axioms that we hold to be true during our theories, theoretical explanations of things, theoretical models of things, is subjective. It's from our soul, and that has to do with emotions and values that are endemic to our subject at that place at that time. And all of that is to say that the self is malleable. It is not stuck in one particular area. Even though there seems to be a hierarchy between subjectivity and relativity and objectivity, there really isn't, because of the causally dynamic nature between the three absolutes that all those fields are derived from. Being causally dynamic with each other and not hierarchical means that while it may seem that our soul is in charge of our mind, which is in charge of our body, that's not actually the case, because you can torture people and you can use and abuse their body to warp and change their mind or even their soul, which is why we don't allow rape. If the soul were truly above the body in the hierarchy, then the soul would not depend upon the body in order for it to change. The soul would just be independent and do whatever it does, and then the body would be totally dependent and do whatever the soul says, even vicariously through the mind. And the mind then, of course, would also equally be a tool of the soul, just some instrument, some disposable item that the soul is utilizing in order to gain whatever it wants from the world. And that's not true. Nor is it true that the body is above the soul hierarchically. So, or the mind for that matter. So there's not a hierarchy, there's a dynamism. And the body influences the mind and the soul, and the mind influences the soul and the body, and the soul influences the mind and the body. So they all influence each other. And God isn't a subject, but God also isn't a relation, and God isn't an objective artifact, physical artifact. God is transcendent to all three of those things, and who created all three of those things. So in lucidity, the next field up from the three absolutes would then be the field of modality, which creates the three absolutes. But yet there's God beyond that, because God is what created the field of modality. So in the religion of lucidity, its scope only has two real stages and one God stage. Whereas in the future, that will be absolutely laughable, and it'll be like, well, how could you ever have less than three, at least, Mr. 3? So I might maybe come out with another one before I'm dead, but at this moment, the furthest that I've been able to go is the field of modality, which then creates the three absolutes. Using causal dynamism in a modal field. Now, where that came from, I don't know yet. I haven't gone that far, but there will be another level beyond it, in between God and it. So I guess I would have to put something indiscernible there, and then there would be God. So there's the three absolutes, and those are the core axioms that you have to assert in order to build the field of subjectivity, relativity, and objectivity, respectively, to nothing, indiscernibility, and being. So, beyond that, then, there would be the field of modality, and then beyond that, there would be something that we don't know what it is, but it's there. It's not nothing. It's not any of the absolutes, but we don't know what that is, and it's a distance in between the field of modality and God. But there is some distance, and in that distance, we're going to find an infinite number of vertically ascended fields that nest within them the fields that we already know about. We already know about the three absolute field, or the three fields of subjectivity, relativity, and objectivity, which are derived from the three absolutes. And then we know about the field of modality, from which those three fields are derived. And then there must be some field that's beyond the field of modality, from which the field of modality is derived, and so on and so forth for infinity until you reach God, after having already traversed an infinitude of distance. And the level of lucidity that one has corresponds to the length of not that infinite line shrinking, because we'll never know what the edge of that is. It will never shrink. It will always remain infinite. But the length of the line that's before it. So the length of my line is as short as you could possibly make a line, which is you've got the three absolutes as one point, which compose of the, I guess you would call it the field of unity, which is nested within the field of modality, and that's the other point in the line, and so it's got a length of 2 points. Now, if you have something that is further than that, you'd have 3, and then 4, and 5, and 6, and so on, all the way up to infinity. And then the last infinite point, the last point of infinity, would then make the entire line of creation, which separates us from God. And the more that we learn about these hierarchical nested fields, the closer that we get to God, relatively speaking. Now, from an absolute standpoint, we can't use that as an absolute reference, so we can't judge each other and say that this person is going to hell and this person is going to heaven. But what we can say is that this person has a greater depth than this other person. A depth of lucidity. So, and again, all lucidity is just being able to recognize the fact that those three absolutes are not the end of the discussion. That you can't just end the discussion and say, this is the way that it is, and that's all. Basically, if lucidity has anything to say for itself at all, it's that you can't claim that there are any universal truths, that there's no such thing as a universal truth that you could ever utilize in an objective field, or even in a relativistic theoretical field, or even in a subjective field, but that the understanding of God, the way that God truly is necessarily beyond all those fields. But yet, it's still valuable for us to learn about them, because that is the distance between us and God. So as long as we're traveling that path, we're good, but the progress is relative upon it, not objective. So we don't ever reach the destination. In all the other religions, there's at least one point at which someone achieved the absolute, where there was no more room for growth, that they just simply existed at that state. It's going to be the Messiah, right, that does that. The religious icon in the religion does that. But lucidity is new in the sense that it doesn't have an end point that we could ever reach. It has an end point that's infinitely far away. So that if you were to be considered a Messiah or an icon, there wouldn't only be one. There would be an infinite number, and there'd be great debate as to who should be considered part of that or not. It would not be there they are and that's who they are and the end, and no one else will ever be that, and they are all that could ever have been it, kind of a thing. When you get to that level of belief, you lose awareness of everything else, and you do become absorbed in something. But like Dr. Peterson was referring to, and I agree with him, is I don't think that's healthy. I don't think that it's healthy for us to do that, because we end up becoming intolerant of all the other views that exist. And we become intolerant of all the people that are possessed by those ideas. And we become intolerant of the world itself existing the way that it does. And then we feel an urge to act or change it. and then we do. And it's always for the worse, because even if it is for the better in the short term, you end up with Hitler at the top, and, great, Germany pulled itself out of its economic depression. That's good. But at the cost of 6 million lives. And so it doesn't pan out in the end. It might be okay in the short term, in the same way that a drug will pick you up out of your depression in the short term, but in the long term, it's going to leave you in a worse position than you were in when you started. And so that's the position that Lucidity takes in regards to other religions, is that the reason that Lucidity considers itself to be legitimate and it doesn't consider the other religions to be legitimate is that the other religions don't tolerate each other. So Lucidity tolerates them, but it doesn't consider them to be like the right religion. In other words, someone from Lucidity would say that if you follow a submodal view, that you're really, from a lucid standpoint, insane. And you need to experience more of the world so that you can broaden your horizons and you can understand multiple points of view, so that you can tolerate other points of view, so that you don't feel compelled to end the existence of those views. And if there was any way of offering salvation to humankind, then that would be it for Lucidity, is to just simply bestow upon us the ability to tolerate each other. Now, it will still allow for judgment in some sense, because we have to judge, but it does so at the one step back from the edge rule, is that if you want to push things all the way to the fucking edge, take it one step before that, where you have at least a little bit of doubt in you, in saying that, maybe this isn't actually the best course of action. Don't ever get to a point where you become so possessed by an idea that you literally become an extension of it. Exert yourself as a subject, and a subject is unpredictable by nature. That's how they choose things. Learn, grow, change. Don't just stay in the same position. So, is it okay to take a position? Of course. But you don't take the position at the exclusion of any possibility of there being any other choice. You don't say that this choice is unequivocally, universally, of a particular value. Even for something like mathematics, you don't even go that far with it and say, well, math just is true. Well, maybe it isn't. Maybe it's an invention. Maybe it's just something that we discovered along our way to something better. I don't know. But I believe that math is real, but I'm not going to go so far into the paint with that to say that I don't believe that it's possible that it couldn't be. I believe that it's possible that it could be, but I don't believe that it's impossible that it isn't. So if I go to a place where I say that it's impossible that math doesn't exist, then I cannot tolerate anyone saying that it doesn't, because it's simply wrong. And so then I can't accept it. So then I have to confront it, and then I become antagonistic and intolerant, and I can't work with this person. I have to just destroy them or desperately try to convert them, but I can't accept them the way that they are, unless I say, well, maybe math isn't actually real. Maybe there really is an alternative out there, and I haven't seen enough evidence to compel me to actively believe in it, but I passively believe in it. I believe that it's possible, but I don't think that it's actual. I believe that it's actually the case that math is real, but it's possible that it may not be. And that's how I straddle that line. It's enough to take a position, but it's not enough to take away someone else's. So I guess that's what I would say. You can take a position, and you should take a position, and you must take a position. But you must take a position, you must take your own position, and without taking others' positions away. And that's what lucidity is, in regards to other religions. So it's okay to be a Christian as long as you allow other views to exist and say it may be possible that those other viewpoints are true and that I'm the one that's at fault. But because I believe in God's forgiveness And because I believe that I am doomed to be a sinner and that God recognizes that and doesn't hold that against me, only holds against me my choice of whether I choose to accept God's grace or reject it. And the Christian thing is to accept God's grace. And that, I think, is what it is to be a Christian. To accept God's grace. And, the idea of loving each other, where Christ says that he'll know us by if we love each other as he loved us, or as he loved his disciples, then I think that is, again, a tolerance, because his apostles betrayed him, or at least John did. What was his name? Judas. I keep wanting to call him Icarus. Judas betrayed Jesus, and yet Jesus tolerated him. He didn't kill Judas off, even though he knew, quote unquote, according to the story of the Bible, that he would be betrayed by Judas. He just allowed it to happen. Okay, there it is. That is what makes Christ Christ. That's what makes Jesus Jesus. And I think that is very powerful and shouldn't be tossed out. I really like that view. I think that that's a very good view, that we tolerate and even love and eat with and give bread to our enemies and feed them and clothe them and take care of them, because we could make a mistake and think someone's Judas because we don't know, and we think they're Judas, and actually they're not. They're loyal to the end, but we think that they aren't, and so then we end up killing them off and we're wrong. But if we love them despite that, then we'll love them and they'll be right and we'll be right. And it also gives them a chance to, if they want, to take that path on themselves. If maybe they had betrayed us, and then we treat them, with love anyway, not to the point of saying that, oh, well, I believe you didn't do it. They'll still believe what they believe. It's not a point of lying to oneself and saying, well, this person actually is perfectly good in every way, and I'll just plaster a fake smile on my face and sweetly talk to them and give them gifts and stuff, but my heart hates them. You don't do that. You try to recognize that your heart hates them first, and then recognize that that's okay, because you're a sinner, you're gonna hate people. So don't hate yourself for hating them. Don't make it worse. So then you recognize that, okay, I hate this guy, or I hate this chick. And then you say, okay, why do I hate this person? Well, because they did this, or they didn't do that, or they said, or whatever. And then I recognize, wait a minute, they're all sinners too. They're not perfect either. And what about all the times that I fucked up? I'm not perfect. And maybe they didn't actually do that, or maybe they did do it, but to them they had some reason. What reason could that be? And have it actually make sense. Don't be, well, they're evil, so of course they did that. They have to have a real rational reason. And then you discover what that real rational reason is, and while you may not be able to accept it, you can at least understand it. And that understanding will then quell your anger and your hatred, because your hatred is stemming from fear of not knowing why this person did this, or why this person said this, or didn't say, or didn't do something. It's in the unknowing of why did they act like that makes you hate them, because it scares you that they would ever do that, and it horrifies you that there are people out there that would do that. And then you're like, well, so then there's not really any room for my acceptance of this person because they did that. If you were put into a similar situation that they were put in, and you were raised the way they were raised, and you had the inclinations in you that they have, then you would make the same choices that they made. They're not the devil. They're not pure evil incarnate. There's something good in them that just hasn't grown enough for it to be overpowering their darkness. So even if you find a real life, I keep wanting to say Icarus, Judas, then you still can't go so far into the paint to say that it isn't possible for them to change, that it isn't possible for them to ever be any different. It is. It is possible. In fact, it's destined that they will and must, or they're just going to be destroyed, which isn't your problem and it isn't your ability to do. You can't kill their soul. I don't care who you are. So you could destroy their body, you could destroy their mind, drive them insane. You could destroy your relationship with them and say, I don't ever want to see you again. You can do all that, but their soul is still there. So even if you think that destroying them is the right answer, you can't even do that. So that's not the right answer. The right answer is to say there must be some reason that this person committed this act or something. And then you try to rationalize why that would actually make sense to you doing it. You have to put yourself in those shoes. And this is what dying for someone's sins and washing the feet of your people around you, of your friends and your enemies, is. And this is the healing of the sick, is that you have to actually take the sickness onto yourself. You can't say, well, they just do it because they're crazy and stupid and evil. There has to be a real reason. You can't just dismiss it. And every time you dismiss it, you'll feel that pain, that oh, something isn't right. You'll feel like something's not right, that there's not something that's done that should have been done. And what that is that you didn't reach a point of understanding. And God is trying to give you an opportunity to do that, or at least there is an opportunity to do that, regardless of where it came from. There is an opportunity always to understand why this person did this. You don't have to accept it. You don't have to say it was the right thing to do. You can still pass judgment on it, but you don't let the judgment pass on to you. You don't say, well, they're not even worth the time, and they're just doing it because they're sick, and they're just doing it because there's something wrong with them. Well, obviously that can't be the case, because if that's simple, they wouldn't be alive. That's a cartoon character. That's an 80s arch villain. They don't have any purpose. They don't have any plot other than to just antagonize you. Of course that's not the answer. That's a child's dilemma that they run across when they're like 2. No, it's obviously more complex than that. So they did something that you don't find. Let's say they raped somebody. Why would you rape somebody? Well, the reason that someone would rape someone is because they feel some compulsion to rape, right? It isn't that they calculate the probability of them getting laid without it or not. Although I'm sure that that's sort of tangentially in there, but it's probably not the main reason. The main reason would be some compulsion. Why do they have this compulsion? Well, I watched a documentary recently about Gacy, and they said in it, and I think this made sense, to me anyway, it made sense, that when somebody gets raised by parents who make you feel shame in conjunction with your sexuality, then you tend to conjoin them together, and so then shame actually starts turning you on because it was put there in your environment together with the sexual arousal. So you'll experience sexual arousal, and then it'll be followed by or during shame. And so then you find shameful things to be sexually arousing, and the more shameful that it is, the more sexually arousing that it is. And that's what makes it sexually arousing, is that it is shameful. And the reason that that happens is because the mind has to adapt to its environment. It gets put into an environment in which shame and sex are put together, conjoined, that they're not separated, where the parent in a case where this doesn't happen, the parent doesn't shame the child for feeling, or adolescent or whatever, young adult, from feeling sexual arousal. They just say, well, that happens. Everybody has sexual arousal, and everybody has sexual arousal for whatever they're going to do. And the only thing that you really need to watch out for is that you don't take away someone else's. If you take away someone else's sexual arousal, it's because you've crossed a boundary that you shouldn't cross. You're doing something that they don't like. And so then you just don't do that, and then you're fine. And also, of course, contraception, protect yourself, protect them. Make sure you don't get pregnant, make sure you don't get an STD, all the biology, all the objective stuff. But spiritually, the only thing you have to worry about after all that's taken care of is you can't do something that's going to cross the line, the boundaries. And that's going to depend on your religion, your culture, the other person that's involved in the act, but mainly, most importantly, the two individuals involved in the act. And as long as there's no one else that necessarily has to be impacted by that, such as if it's two kids fucking and they end up getting pregnant or getting an STD, or one of them rapes the other one midway through, or they fuck up and some accident happens, or something like that, and serious injury occurs, that would then necessitate the parents, and all of that stuff, having to deal with bad actions. So, kind of, it's not exactly the case that you just don't let your parents fight out, because you should have a good enough relationship with your parents that you can tell them whatever it is that you've done. So I wouldn't advocate for that either. It's not that you just do it and see if you can get away with it, and as long as you didn't get caught, then you're fine. That's not it. It's that your action doesn't necessitate the lack of consent from anyone that's necessarily directly involved with it. Now, that doesn't mean that you get to occupy whatever position that you want at no consequence. It just means that if you're independent enough where no one else is necessarily impacted by your decisions, then you're an adult. But if you are still dependent upon someone else, such as if you're in a mental institution, if you're in jail, or if you're a child, then you can't go out and do whatever you want anymore because you're depending on someone else. And so then whatever they say goes, and that's the way that it is, and that's the way it should be. But the moment that you get to actualize, and they always must give you this opportunity, although you may not take it, you have to always have the opportunity to become independent. And that doesn't mean that they let you go fuck or do drugs or something like that. It means that they let you become independent. It means that you undergo the process by which you become independent. After you do that, then you can have sex and do drugs and all that stuff. But you have to undergo the process of independence first. You have to become independent first, and then you can engage in independent activities. But you have to become independent first. And I think that's something that everybody could pretty much agree on. The vast majority of humans, I think, could agree on that. People, I think, could agree on that. So that's the lucid point of view as far as like what is, the self, and how does the self interact with the world, and all of that. And I dragged this on way too long, but oh well.